Connor Walsh walked into Mercer Arms on a Saturday morning in July, looking exactly like what he was, a working man. Worn leather jacket, faded jeans, boots with the heels ground down from years of concrete floors and long shifts. He did not check his reflection in the glass door on the way in. He did not adjust his collar or straighten up for anyone. He walked to the display case, looked through the glass at the row of handguns lined up beneath the fluorescent lights, and pointed to one near the center. "I'd like to see the Glock 19, he said. Brad was the first one to look up. He was 34, the senior floor associate, and he had a habit of reading people the way some people read weather: fast, confident, and often wrong. He looked at Connor from the top of his head to the soles of his boots. He took in the jacket, the jeans, the quiet way the man stood with his hands loose at his sides. Then he smiled. The particular smile of someone who has already decided the answer before hearing the question. "You know that one runs close to 700, right?" He said it politely. He said it the way you'd warn someone that a restaurant was out of their price range, helpful, almost kind, except for the edge underneath it that wasn't kind at all. Troy was standing 2 feet to Brad's right, and he leaned slightly toward Mara and said, just loud enough, maybe we should point him toward Walmart. The two of them laughed, not loud, not cruel in any theatrical way, just the small, dismissive laugh of people who had already placed this man in a category and found the category amusing. Connor heard all of it. He did not turn around, but his jaw tightened once, briefly, the way a man's jaw tightens when he decides not to say the thing he could say. He looked at them, not through them, not past them, directly at them with full attention. The way you look at something you are trying to understand, rather than something you are trying to avoid. And then he smiled. It was not the smile of a man who was embarrassed. It was not the tight, controlled smile of someone swallowing anger. It was calm in a way that felt almost out of place in that room. The kind of calm that does not come from having nothing to worry about, but from having already survived the things worth worrying about. Brad approached with reluctant energy, sliding a budget catalog across the glass toward Connor as though the conversation were already settled. The premium models, the ones Connor had been studying through the case, Brad simply did not acknowledge. Those start around 1800, he said, in the tone of someone explaining that a first-class seat costs more than coach, as though the information itself were the kindness. Connor looked at the catalog without picking it up. Then he looked back at the case. "I want to compare the trigger pull on the Nighthawk Custom," he said. "The government model. I've been running the numbers on the weight differential between the standard and the match-grade variants." Brad blinked. He reached for the product manual on the shelf behind him, opened it to the wrong page, found the right section, and then stood there reading it with the deliberate focus of a man buying time. He could not find what Connor was asking for. Connor waited. Then, without drama, he read the specifications from memory: trigger pull weight, reset distance, the tolerances on the barrel fit each figure exact, each delivered with the flat precision of someone for whom firearms were not a novelty. Brad closed the manual. He said he would check with the back and walked away. Connor turned, found the chair in the far corner of the shop, back against the wall, facing the entrance, and sat down. He folded his hands on his knees. He did not look at anyone. He did not look at his phone. He sat the way a man sits, when waiting is not a problem, when stillness is not a performance, but a condition. It was the posture of someone who had learned in rooms far more dangerous than this one that the most important thing you can do in any room is stay exactly who you are. Mara watched him from behind the counter. She was 25, the youngest person on the floor, and she had laughed earlier, the reflexive kind, half a breath, because Brad had laughed and because it was easier. But watching Connor walk to that corner chair and settle into it with that complete self-possession, she felt something she did not have a word for. Not guilt exactly, something closer to unease, or the beginning of a question she hadn't thought to ask before. She picked up a glass of water from behind the counter, crossed the floor without announcing herself, and set it on the small table beside his chair. She did not say anything. She did not explain the gesture. She turned and walked back. Connor looked at the glass. Then he looked at the back of Mara's head. His expression, if anything, was more attentive than it had been before. There are things a man carries that do not show up on the outside, not at first. Not if he has learned to move in the world without requiring anything from it, without requiring acknowledgement or accommodation, or the particular generosity of being seen. Connor Walsh had learned that. He had learned it over 8 years in the Army, 2 tours in places where the margin between a good decision and a catastrophic one was often measured in seconds, and he had learned it again in the 2 years since he had come home to an empty side of the bed and a son who still sometimes called for his mother in the middle of the night. Sarah Walsh had been 36 years old when the diagnosis came. The cancer had been there quietly, doing its work, for longer than anyone knew by the time they found it. They were already in a conversation about stages and odds that Connor had not been prepared for, that no amount of training could have prepared a man for. He had left the Army after his second extension because her treatments had moved into the phase where she needed someone at home, and he had chosen without hesitation. He had not weighed the options. He had simply walked toward the thing that needed him most, the way he always had. She had fought. That was the word people used afterward, and it was accurate. She had fought with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had things she was not finished with, a son she was not finished raising, a husband she had not finished loving. But the fighting had ended on a Tuesday in October, 22 months ago, quietly, without announcement, and Connor had been left alone in a house in Franklin, Tennessee, with an 8-year-old boy and the blueprint for a life that no longer had its architect. He had sold his guns after she died, not because he was afraid of them, but because he was not sure, in those first months, of the version of himself that might pick one up in the dark. That was an honest thing, and he was an honest man. He had put everything into a safe, then moved the safe, then sold the contents to a dealer 2 towns over. He had not bought anything since. Liam was 8 now. He slept through the night. Connor worked second shift at a fabrication shop on the edge of Franklin, the 3:30 to midnight run, which meant his son was alone in the house from the time school let out until long after he should have been asleep. Connor's neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, checked in most evenings. But Mrs. Pacheco was 71 and moved slowly and lived 3 houses down, and between her front door and Connor's there was a stretch of quiet Tennessee street that felt different at night than it did in the day. He wanted something in a locked case in the house. He wanted to know it was there. He had not come to Mercer Arms to make a quick decision. He had come because the decision mattered, because the right firearm for this specific purpose was a question worth answering carefully, and because he had not lost the habit of doing things correctly even when no one was watching. Pete Garza walked through the main floor at 20 minutes past 10, carrying a clipboard and moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has worked the same job for 20 years and has learned exactly how to move through a space without disturbing it. He was 61, with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of hands that tell you everything about a person's history. He passed within 10 feet of the corner chair, and he slowed, just slightly. He looked at Connor the way you look at something you recognize from a distance, something you need a second glance at to be sure. Then he kept moving, through the door that led to the stockroom, and was gone. Connor had not looked up, but something in the room shifted, in the way that small things shift before larger ones follow. The door from the stockroom opened at 11:14 in the morning. Diane Mercer came through it the way she always did on Saturday mornings, moving quickly, already thinking about the inventory discrepancy she had found in the system at 7 a.m., already composing the email she needed to send to the regional supplier. She was 40 years old, and she carried herself like a woman who had built something real with her hands and her grief and her will, and who had learned that the only way to keep something standing is to keep moving. She made it 3 steps past the door before she stopped. It was not a sound that stopped her. It was not anything anyone said. It was the sight of a man sitting in the corner chair, the back against the wall chair, The chair that every person who had spent serious time in a combat zone eventually found without thinking about it, sitting with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the front entrance, in the posture of someone who had learned to stay ready, not as a discipline but as a reflex. Diane Mercer had grown up watching her father sit that way. She stood in the middle of the floor for several seconds. Around her, the shop moved normally. Brad was talking to a walk-in customer near the handgun case. Troy had settled into a chair by the display of cleaning supplies. Mara was standing very still behind the counter. None of them saw what Diane was seeing. None of them were looking for it. She walked toward Connor. Not around the counter. Not through the formal architecture of the transaction. She crossed the open floor directly, stopped in front of his chair, and looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at the world, not at the surface of a thing but into it. "Did you serve?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not the professional quiet of a business owner managing a situation. The quiet of someone asking a question whose answer actually matters. Connor looked up at her. Something in her face, the directness of it, the absence of performance, made him answer without the usual distance. 101st Airborne, he said. 8 years. Diane closed her eyes for a moment. Just long enough to do something private with what she had just heard. When she opened them again, there was something in her expression that could not be faked and could not be learned, the particular quality of someone who has loved a soldier and lost one, and never fully stopped carrying the weight of that loss. She took one small step back. She drew herself upright. She raised her right hand in a salute that was crisp and unhurried and entirely sincere. "Sir," she said, "it's an honor." The shop went quiet. Brad's mouth opened. He did not close it right away. Troy looked over from his chair with a vague, uncomprehending frown. Mara stood behind the counter and looked at Diane, then at Connor, then down at the counter in front of her, and something heavy settled across her shoulders. Connor looked at Diane for a long moment. He did not stand immediately. He let the gesture land the way it was meant to, not as a performance, not as a transaction, but as something given freely by someone who understood exactly what she was giving and why. Then, quietly, he said, "Thank you." It was the most he had said in the last 45 minutes. It was also, in some way he could not have explained, the most he had needed to say. Diane led him to the back office, not because the situation required it, but because she found she did not want to have this conversation in the middle of the floor. There were things she wanted to say that belonged in a quieter space. The office was small and practical. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a corkboard covered in supplier contacts and compliance reminders, and on the desk, positioned so it was the first thing you saw when you sat down, a framed photograph, 8 by 10, in a simple black frame. The man in the photograph was wearing his dress uniform. He was standing in front of an American flag, and he was smiling with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who believed entirely in what he was doing. His eyes had a warmth in them that photographs do not usually capture, but this one had. He looked like a man who understood that he was lucky, and who intended to live accordingly. Sergeant First Class Raymond Mercer, killed in action, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 2012. Diane had been 21 years old. She did not explain the photograph immediately. She sat down across from Connor and let him see it and waited for whatever came next. "I want to apologize for what happened this morning," she said. "In my store, with my employees, that should not have happened." Connor looked at the photograph, then at her. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "The store is my responsibility," she said. "So it is." She told him about her father, the way she had grown up in a house where service was not an abstraction but a daily reality. The discipline of it, the cost of it, the love that ran underneath it like a current that never stopped. Her father had been the kind of man who showed up, not the dramatic kind of showing up, not the kind that requires an audience, but the ordinary, consistent kind that makes a life. He had been there every morning. He had been there at every school play, every soccer game, every awkward dinner table conversation. He had been there in the way that you only fully understand once the person is gone and the absence has a shape. She told Connor about Ray, about meeting him when she was 19 and he was 23, both of them at a 4th of July cookout at her cousin's house in Murfreesboro, both of them reaching for the last ear of corn at the same moment. She laughed a little at that, the small, real laugh of someone remembering something that still belongs to happiness even though it connects to grief. They had been married for 14 months when he deployed for the second time. She had been 21 when the call came. "I bought this place with what he left me," she said. "The insurance, the savings. It wasn't enough on its own. I had to take out a loan, find a partner who eventually sold me his share, work for 3 years before the numbers stopped being terrifying." She paused, looking at the photograph. "But I knew what I wanted it to be. I knew that, from the beginning, a place where people who served would walk through that door and be treated the way Ray deserved to be treated, the way my father deserved to be treated. Where no one would look at a man's jacket and decide the conversation was already over." She was quiet for a moment. "That's what this place is supposed to be," she said. "And this morning, it wasn't." Connor was quiet for a moment. He looked at the photograph again the way a person looks at a photograph when they recognize something in it. Not just see it, but recognize it. "He's proud of you," he said plainly, without sentiment. The way a man says something true. Diane looked at him. She did not speak for a moment. It was not the first time someone had said something like that to her, but it was the first time in a long time that it had come from someone who said it without needing anything from her in return. No sympathy, no validation, no bridge back to their own story. He said it because it was what he saw. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me about your son," she said. Connor told her, not everything, but the important things. That Liam was 8 and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, which made Diane smile. That Sarah had fought hard and had still lost, and that the months after had been the kind of months you don't look back on directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun. That he worked second shift at the fabrication shop because the money was better and the health insurance was solid, and those two things mattered more now than the hours did. "He's alone from 3:30 until midnight," Connor said. "Mrs. Pacheco checks on him. She's a good woman. She lives 3 houses down, but I want something in the house. In a locked case. He knows not to touch it, but I want to know it's there." He said it simply, without defensiveness, not asking for permission or approval. Just explaining. Diane nodded. She understood the particular arithmetic of that decision, the math of love and risk. The things you do when you are the only line between your child and a world that does not ask permission. She had done versions of that math herself, in different configurations, for most of her adult life. "What was she like?" Diane asked. Connor considered the question the way he considered most things without hurry. "Stubborn." She had this way of making a joke about something that was actually serious, so you'd laugh and then you'd think about it for 3 days. He paused. She wanted Liam to know how to handle a firearm safely. Not as a sport, not for any particular reason, just because she thought it was part of growing up right. We'd talked about it. "So, you're finishing that conversation," Diane said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Outside the office door, the floor of Mercer Arms continued its ordinary Saturday morning. Brad had moved to the far end of the display case and was attending to a customer with the careful attention of a man trying to look like he has not just heard something about himself that he cannot unhear. Troy had gone quiet entirely, the particular quiet of someone recalculating. Mara stood behind the counter and did not look busy, because she was not busy. She was holding the registration form she had pulled from the system when Connor first came in the form she had looked at, read, set down, and not mentioned. Her eyes moved from the form to Brad and back again. The weight of the thing she had read sat in her chest with the specific discomfort of knowledge that arrives too late to do anything with. Except carry it and decide what kind of person you are going to be going forward. At 11:47, Pete Garza came back through the stockroom door. He was carrying something in addition to his clipboard, a folded piece of newspaper, creased carefully and sealed in a small plastic sleeve. He walked to the counter, waited until Diane came out of the back office, and set it in front of her without preamble. "I recognized him when he walked in," Pete said, in the quiet, factual tone of a man who deals in facts. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." Diane looked at the newspaper. It was a clipping from the Franklin Courier-Press, dated 13 years earlier. The photograph showed a younger version of the man, now sitting in her back office leaner, the face less settled, but unmistakably the same man. The headline above the photograph read, "Local Soldier Receives Army Commendation Medal." The article beneath it described, in the careful language of local journalism, how Sergeant Connor Walsh of the Army's 101st Airborne Division, assigned to an explosive ordnance disposal unit, had single-handedly neutralized an improvised explosive device under active fire conditions, without proper equipment, protecting the lives of 4 teammates. 37 minutes. The device had been command-detonated twice. He had stayed on it both times. Diane read the article twice. Then, she looked up. Brad was standing close enough to have read it over her shoulder. His face had gone the color of old ash. He said nothing. Across the floor, Troy had seen Brad's expression and gone very still. Mara looked at the clipping. Then she looked at Diane. Then she looked down at the registration form she was still holding, and the things she had read there settled over her with the full weight of a second understanding of what the words previous occupation and the unit designation and the commendation code on that form actually meant. She had read it, and she had said nothing. She would have to decide what to do with that. Diane picked up the newspaper clipping. She walked out from behind the counter and stood in the middle of the floor. And the room adjusted around her the way rooms adjust when the person who owns them makes clear that something is happening. "I'm Diane Mercer," she said, in the steady, carrying voice of someone who has run a business long enough to know how a room sounds when everyone is listening. "I own this store." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She looked at Brad directly, with the particular calm of a woman who has decided what she is going to say and is simply saying it. "The man who came in here this morning, the man you laughed at, neutralized a command-detonated IED alone, without support equipment, under active fire, to protect the lives of 4 of his teammates. He held that position for 37 minutes. She held up the newspaper clipping briefly, then set it on the counter. That information was available in the Veteran Priority Registration System this store has maintained for 4 years. It was there to be seen by anyone who chose to look. The shop was completely quiet. Brad opened his mouth. What came out was an incomplete sentence, something about procedure, something about not knowing. Diane looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was not soft either. The expression of a woman who has learned that the most serious things do not require volume. "You didn't know," she said, "because you didn't look. And you didn't look because you had already decided." She paused. "That's what we are going to talk about. Not today, in front of everyone, but we are going to talk about it." She let the silence do the rest of its work. Then she said, "Mara, can you cover the floor for a few minutes?" Mara said she could. Connor had come out of the back hallway without anyone noticing. He moved quietly. A habit from years in places where moving quietly was a survival skill, and he was standing in the doorframe, watching. He had heard enough. He said, "You don't have to do this." Diane turned and looked at him with the clear, unhurried gaze of a woman who has thought about exactly this kind of moment and knows what she believes. "Yes, I do," she said. "Not for you, for what this place is supposed to be." Brad's conversation with Diane took place in the back office, behind the closed door, for 11 minutes. No one on the floor heard what was said. What they saw was a man in his mid-30s go in there looking the way men look when they know they have been correctly identified, and come out looking the way men look when they have been offered something they did not expect. Not absolution, but clarity. The hard, useful kind. Troy had left by then. He had remembered an errand and excused himself with the practiced casualness of a man who has decided that the next few minutes in this room are not going to be comfortable and that he would rather not be present for them. Mara found Connor near the display case. She did not wait for an opening, she just walked up to him and stood 2 feet away with her hands at her sides and looked at him directly. "I read your form when you first came in," she said. "The previous occupation line, the unit designation." She paused. Connor looked at her the way he looked at most things, without hurry, without performance. He considered her for a moment, the way you consider someone who has just told you something true that cost them something. "Thank you for saying that," he told her. It was not absolution. It was not the erasure of the morning, but it was the acknowledgement that a person had looked at themselves and decided to be different, and that the decision deserved to be seen. Mara nodded once, and something across her shoulders eased not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Diane handled the paperwork herself. She ran Connor's information through the Veteran Priority Channel, a program the store had set up 4 years ago that reduced the standard wait time from several days down to same-day processing for clean purchases, and his was clean. She pulled the Ruger 10-22 from the case, a good rifle for what he needed, light enough for Liam to eventually handle, with proper supervision, mechanically reliable, accurate at the ranges a child learning would actually use. She walked Connor through the configuration, answered the questions he asked, which were the right questions, and wrote up the receipt without upselling him on a single thing he had not asked for. She also pulled the Glock 19 from the case and set it on the felt mat. "You came in for this," she said. "I did," he said. "Then let's make sure you leave with what you came for." He smiled. It was the first time he had smiled all morning, and it was small and real and arrived without any particular announcement, the way real things do. Connor Walsh sat in his truck for a while before starting it. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the middle distance, the way you look at nothing when you are actually looking at something internal. The box from the gun shop was on the passenger seat. The paperwork was folded neatly in the bag beside it. He thought about Sarah. Not the end of it, not the hospital, not the last weeks, not the quiet Tuesday morning when she had simply stopped. He thought about the version of her he kept on purpose. Sarah at the kitchen table with her coffee and her crossword puzzle on Sunday mornings, bare feet, hair not done yet, entirely at ease in the unhurried architecture of an ordinary day. Sarah at Liam's first school play, making eye contact with Connor across the auditorium in that private way that couples develop over years of shared attention to a shared thing they love. The look that says, "I see what you see, and I feel what you feel, and we are doing this together." Sarah, on the back porch in the evenings the summer before the diagnosis, talking about things that seemed ordinary then and enormous now, whether they should get a dog, whether Liam would take to music or sports, what they wanted the next 10 years to look like. They had been so specific. They had made so many plans. And then the plans had simply ended the way things end, without announcement, without warning, without anything as merciful as a clear signal, and he had been left alone in the house with an 8-year-old and a set of blueprints for a life that no longer had its architect. He thought about the woman who had walked through the back door of this shop at 11:14 in the morning, the look on her face when he said his unit, the way she had closed her eyes for just a moment, the way a person closes their eyes when they receive something that needs to be held carefully. The salute she had given him, not a performance, not a customer service gesture, but the act of a woman who had learned the meaning of that salute at the greatest possible cost and had chosen to give it anyway. There was something in Diane Mercer that he recognized in the way you recognize a key that fits the same lock as yours. Not identical, not interchangeable, but shaped by the same kind of door. He picked up his phone and called Liam. The boy answered on the second ring, which meant he was somewhere comfortable, probably on the couch, probably watching something he was not supposed to be watching before lunch. "Hey, Bug," Connor said. "Dad." A pause, the energetic pause of an 8-year-old recalibrating toward conversation. "Did you get it?" "I got it. Did you get ice cream too?" Connor laughed. It was the first time he had laughed all morning, and it came out easy and real, the way laughter does when it is not performed. "I didn't get ice cream," he said, "but we can fix that. I'm on my way. Okay?" Another pause, longer than you would expect. "Dad, you sound different." He thought about that for a moment. The way the morning had started and the way it was ending, and the distance between those two things that somehow felt navigable now in a way it had not at 8 o'clock. "Good, different, or bad different?" he asked. Liam considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions, a seriousness he had inherited completely from his mother. "Good different," he decided. Connor started the truck. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he checked the rearview mirror, a habit. Automatic. The legacy of years of training that had become instinct. In the mirror, he saw the front of Mercer Arms receding, and in the doorway, just visible, Diane Mercer standing with her arms crossed, watching his truck reach the road. She turned back inside before he pulled into traffic. He drove home, but the image of her standing there stayed with him for the rest of the day and into the evening, and was still there in some quiet corner of his mind when he turned off the light in Liam's room that night and stood for a moment in the dark hallway, listening to his son breathe. 3 weeks later, Connor Walsh pulled into the Mercer Arms parking lot on a Saturday morning. Same truck, same jacket, same boots. But he was not alone. Liam climbed out of the passenger side in the enthusiastic, slightly disorganized way of 8-year-olds exiting vehicles, and he had a piece of paper in his hand that he had been protecting during the entire drive, with a seriousness he typically reserved for very important things. He had been working on it since Thursday. He had told Connor it was for the lady at the gun shop. When Connor asked how he knew about the lady at the gun shop, Liam looked at him with the long-suffering expression he had inherited entirely from his mother, and said that Connor talked about it more than he thought he did. Connor had not argued the point, because it was true. Diane was behind the front counter when they came in. She looked up at the sound of the door, and her face did the thing faces do when the person arriving is someone unexpected but welcome, a brief brightening, quickly composed. She looked at Liam, then at Connor. Liam crossed the floor with the directness of a child who has decided something and gone ahead with it. He held out the piece of paper with both hands. "I drew your store," he said. "My dad told me about it." Diane took the paper carefully and looked at it. It was drawn in the ambitious mixed-media style of third graders, everywhere crayon and marker, some pencil, a level of perspective that prioritized feeling over geometry. There was a building rendered in brown with a sign on top that said Mercer in large uneven letters. There was a man in a brown jacket standing in front of it, and there was a woman with yellow-orange hair standing next to him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Both of them were smiling. Diane looked at the drawing for a long moment. She did not say anything immediately, and Connor recognized the quality of the silence, the same silence he had occupied in his truck 3 weeks ago, the silence of someone letting something settle into a place that matters. "This is beautiful," she said finally. "I used the good markers," Liam told her with the earnest pride of someone explaining their process. "The ones I'm not supposed to use for homework." Diane smiled at that, a real smile. The unguarded kind. The kind that arrives without any effort and says more than anything composed could say. "I'm going to put this on my wall," she said. Mara had come out from the back at the sound of the door. She stood now at the end of the counter, watching Liam with an expression that was different from any expression she had worn 3 weeks ago, quieter, more considered. She came around the counter and crouched down to Liam's level. "This is really good," she said, looking at the drawing. "You're a good artist." Liam looked at her appraisingly, with the frank assessment of a child who takes compliments seriously. "Thank you," he said. "My dad says if you're going to do something, you should do it right." Mara looked up at Connor. He met her eyes and gave a small, unhurried nod. Not forgiveness fully, not the eraser of the morning 3 weeks ago, but something like the acknowledgement of movement, the recognition that a person had looked at themselves and decided to be different, and that the decision deserved to be seen. Mara nodded back. Then she straightened and went back to work. Connor turned to find Diane beside him. "He wanted to take the safety course," he said. "I looked it up on your website. The junior program. For kids in single-parent households," Diane said. "It runs on Saturday mornings. First session starts in about 20 minutes. "Good timing," Connor said. "Very good timing," she agreed. She took Liam to the classroom in the back, a real room, set up with small chairs and a low table and the kind of careful, patient infrastructure of someone who had thought hard about what children need in order to feel safe while learning something serious. Liam went without hesitation because he was his father's son, and hesitation was not in his nature. He found a seat in the front row, set his jacket on the back of the chair, and looked around at the room with the alert, eager interest of a boy ready to begin. Connor stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. Then he stepped back into the main floor and stood the way he always stood. Jacket, jeans, boots, hands loose at his sides. When Diane came back out of the classroom, closing the door quietly behind her, she stopped next to Connor in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The morning light was coming in clean and level through the front windows, and the shop was doing its ordinary Saturday business around them. And there was something about standing here, in this particular light, in this particular quiet, that felt different from the ordinary. "He's going to be good at this," Diane said. "He's good at everything he decides to be good at," Connor said. Diane nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The session runs for an hour." She paused. "There's coffee in the back office, if you want to." She stopped, started differently. "You're welcome to wait here." He looked at her. "I was planning to," he said. "A beat." "The course runs every Saturday," Diane said. "Then he'll want to come back next week," Connor said. Diane turned slightly toward him. "Just him?" Connor held her gaze. And this time the smile that came to his face was not the enigmatic, unreadable calm of a man who had learned to give nothing away. It was simple and certain and entirely present, the smile of a man who has survived enough to know the difference between what is worth holding and what is worth letting himself reach for. "No," he said quietly, "not just him. Some mornings change more than they appear to. They begin as one thing, a transaction, a routine, an ordinary Saturday in an ordinary town, and end as something else entirely. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with any particular sign that this will be the morning you remember. They just happen the way all important things happen, one moment at a time, in the small and ordinary space between who you were and who you are becoming. A man walks into a store. He walks in, wearing the evidence of his life on his body, the jacket, the boots, the particular way he holds himself after everything he has been through, and two people behind a counter decide in the first 5 seconds who he is. And they are wrong. Not because they are evil, but because they are careless. And because carelessness about other people is the most common way we fail each other. And because failing each other in small ways in the morning has a way of becoming the shape of a life if no one ever holds up a mirror. And then a door opens from the back, and someone who knows how to look at the world with the eyes of someone who has lost something irreplaceable walks onto the floor and looks at that man, not at his jacket, not at his silence, not at the particular worn quality of a person who has been carrying more than their share, and sees him, the real him, the one who was there all along. Being seen does not fix everything. It does not bring back what was lost. It does not undo the years or close the distance that grief opens in a person. But it changes the shape of the morning, and the shape of the morning changes the shape of the weeks that follow. And the weeks become something that looks, from a certain angle, like a beginning. Sometimes that is all it takes, one person who knows how to look at another person and see them. Steady as something that has already been through the fire, patient as stone, and still, after everything, open,